Welcome to Talks at Google in Cambridge, Mass. My grandmother grew up in a small village outside of Rome. If there were no tomatoes in the garden, you had the zucchini. If you wanted eggs for breakfast, check with the hen. Today we have access to whatever foods we want when we want. But what is the trade-off? Is the convenience worth it if we are putting our and our children's health in jeopardy? Why has there been a spike in chronic illness in our youth? And what can we do to prevent it? In her book, The Dirt Cure, Dr. Maya asks these questions and many more regarding allergies, medications, and the foods we eat, and how they will affect our generation and the next. It reveals to us why dirt is the new healthy. With that, please help me welcome Dr. Maya Shetreat-Klein.
Hello. All right. So I'm going to be talking about something pretty low tech in one of the highly technological places in the country. And I want to start for a minute just to ask you to close your eyes. And I want you to picture what a healthy person looks like. It could be a healthy kid. It could be a healthy adult. Just close your eyes and kind of picture that for a second. And open your eyes, and can you tell me what kind of qualities you noticed in the person in your imagination, the healthy person? Yell it out. Skin tone. Skin tone.
They were
smiling. Smiling, okay. Ooh, what? Energetic. Great. Okay, so the reason that I asked this question is because we spend a lot of time thinking about disease and sickness, and I think we've forgotten a little bit what healthy really looks like and what we're kind of aiming for. And it's funny, when I talk to doctors in particular, they're often kind of stumped by this question because, for them, health is often like the absence of disease. You're not sick, you're healthy. But I don't actually agree that that's the case, and there's sort of this attitude in medicine, you should be happy you're not dead. Like, that's kind of where, like however you want to give birth or however you want to, whatever kind of intervention you've had in the hospital, if you're alive, you're happy, So that's not always true. And I think health is more than the absence of disease. And it's not just a reflection of whether we face stressors or show symptoms, right? People will come to me and say, oh, I'm so healthy, I never get sick, I never have a cold, or my kid never gets ear infection. Like, yes, great, that can be very good, but that's not all that health is. And it's not simply lab results or other kinds of scientific measures. I get a lot of that when I talk to doctors too. So health really, it reflects the relationship between your internal and your external terrain, okay? So health is really, it's fluid, it's a relationship, and it's something that it's always in flux. So health really manifests as resilience. And resilience is the ability to bounce back. So really, it's not so much the stressors, right? Stressors are inevitable. And actually, they're necessary to build resilience. If you don't have those stressors, then it's much less likely that you're going to be resilient and healthy. Now, chronic disease is rising in children and in adults. And I kind of like this little cartoon because when I first started practicing medicine, I had a lot of kids who came to me. So I treat both kids and adults, but mostly kids. And I kept finding that kids were coming in on 3, 4, 5, 6 different prescription medications over the course of a year. They'd be on their asthma medication, they'd be on their allergy meds, they'd have their steroids for their skin, they'd be getting maybe like Ritalin, or maybe they'd be getting an antidepressant for anxiety. There was a long list, they'd get their Miralax for constipation, right? So there's like always a lot going on, even with kids, and let alone adults, right? So chronic disease actually, I believe, results from a lack of resilience. And there's science to show this. sometimes I say things that people have a hard time believing, so I like to have lots of scientific references, so you can always see that I'm not just making it up, and it's not just a theory of my own. This is from a journal called Mitochondrion. Bob Navio, who's an amazing mitochondrial researcher in California, who talks about the cell danger response. And the cell danger response is this metabolic response that protects cells and hosts from harm. And basically, any kind of stressor, chemical, physical, biologic stressors that exceed the cellular capacity for homeostasis to stay in balance, okay, triggers this cell danger response. And the cell starts to function differently, kind of in defensive mode. And it's hard when you're in defensive mode to function optimally, right? Because you're not going to be you're not creative. You're not. I mean, think about it. If you're in a defensive state, you don't have all your resources to dedicate to moving forward and to progressing. So after the danger's been eliminated or neutralized, then there's a choreographed sequence of these anti-inflammatory and regenerative pathways that actually reverse the cell danger response and allow healing. But sometimes the cell danger response persists abnormally, and then whole body metabolism, including the gut microbiome, are disturbed, and it can lead to multiple organ system impairment and behavior changes and chronic illness. Okay, this is straight from the paper. And this is just an example of that in a neuron. So we have these microglia, okay, and microglia are these nurse cells in the brain. We have 3 microglia for every 1 neuron in the brain. So they're pretty important. We've ignored them for a long time. We do that in medicine, just kind of say, oh, you're extra. No, not so much. They're actually nurse cells, okay, and they take care of our neurons when things are going nicely. Then when there's the stressor, we have that cell danger response, the microglia become mama bear, okay? They go from being nurturing, nursing, to being kind of, like aggressive, releasing all these inflammatory cytokines, chemokines, and excitotoxins, and it causes a lot of disruption for the neuron. So that is called microglial activation, and it's basically implicated in all different kinds of neurologic conditions, from ADHD and autism to Tourette's to seizures to Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, all basically, you name the chronic neurologic illness, microglial activation is implicated. And there's a whole, what we call immunoexcitotoxicity cascade that happens in that process. And then, if the cell danger response dissipates, then these microglia go back to releasing growth factors and anti-inflammatory cytokines that help regenerate the neurons that were damaged and become the nurse cells again. Okay? So this is kind of the process, and it's happening with different kinds of cells throughout the body, and because I'm a neurologist, I focus on the brain. Okay, so what could cause the cell danger response? What could trigger that? There's a whole lot of things that are different in our bodies that start from preconception, really, but let's say we're talking about our microbiome, right? So our flora, and the microbiome is in the gut, it's also on the skin, it's also in our nasal passageways, right? There's a lot of different microbiomes in our body. So that can be affected by, let's say, how we were born. You know, C-section versus vaginal delivery, formula feeding versus breastfeeding. All of these things influence our microbiome, and our microbiome is influencing our immune system, and our immune system is influencing this cell danger response. Chronic use of antibiotics. So recently a study came out that showed that one round of antibiotics can change your microbiome for an entire year. So that, you know, if we think about, let's say, those people who get a lot of bronchitis, let's say, or the kids who are getting ear infections all the time, getting 3 rounds of antibiotics a year or 4, you know, a lot of people come to me and they'll say, oh, you know, I say, well, so has your child ever been on antibiotics? And they say, oh, no more than anyone else. Well, how many times? Oh, maybe like 5 times a year. I'm like, well, what if I told you some people never are on antibiotics? Maybe that's not so normal. That's affecting the microbiome. Things like acetaminophen, Tylenol, you know, ibuprofen, steroids, all of those things are impacting it. Vaccines and other pharmaceuticals are always influencing microbiome, even ones that we don't think like certain pharmaceuticals that we wouldn't imagine necessarily are influencing the microbiome, like certain mood stabilizers can actually do that, and sometimes that can be why they're associated with weight gain. Processed food, pesticides, and then too much time indoors, because that actually does influence our microbiome, as you'll see. So this is kind of a little bit our terrain right now, and it's a little different, let's say, than it was when I was a kid, very different than when my parents were kids. And our current health paradigm is really this. Avoid, 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 avoid. Whatever it is, you should avoid it, okay? Don't get dirty, don't get out there. We need to protect ourselves from everything dirty. And so I just kind of like to put this slide in because I think it really tells us something. We can't fight nature. We are nature. So if we're fighting it, then it's going to be, we're in trouble, okay? And we need to start getting into this paradigm because the paradigm we're in right now is actually not making us healthier. Partly this is because our bodies crave complexity. We think there's some kind of magic bullet. We were led to believe it was pharmaceuticals that were going to be the magic bullet. I'm not saying I'm not thankful that we have pharmaceuticals. I think they have a place. There have been times I've praised God that we had X, Y, or Z pharmaceuticals. So it's not that. But we are very reliant on that instead of looking at what really the magic bullet is, which is biodiversity. Okay? And I want to talk about that a little bit more. So our nutrition and our stressors really come from our terrain. And so I want to take that sort of moment to say what is terrain, and I kind of will, terrain is really many things, but one of the big things I think it is dirt. And I kind of use dirt as a way to talk about terrain. And dirt is three main things. It's germs and microbes, it's fresh food from healthy soil, and it's time in nature. So let's talk about germs and microbes. We all know about germ theory, right? Our old friend Louis Pasteur, father of pasteurization, said diseases are caused by microorganisms. These small organisms, too small to see without magnification, invade humans, animals, and other living hosts. Their growth and reproduction within their host can cause a disease. Okay? We are sitting ducks. Something will invade us. It will make us sick, and we could die. And when the whole germ theory came out, people became so frightened of germs that actually even fermented foods, which were traditionally eaten, even yogurt, even sourdough bread, was considered contaminated. And it was sort of pushed aside because they thought, well, germs, bad, contamination. Louis Pasteur actually had a colleague at the same time named Claude Bernard, and he actually had a different, they were kind of, I would say, friendly competitors, or frenemies, as my tween would say. And he had this idea that he called cellular theory. He said, most microbial diseases are caused by organisms present in the body of a normal individual. And they become the cause of disease when a disturbance arises which upsets the equilibrium of the body. Well, from everything we're learning, and I'm going to get into this a little bit more, this actually may have real merit, okay? And so I call this the terrain theory. And the story goes that at the end of his life, Louis Pasteur actually said that his colleague was right. He said, it's not the microbe, it's the terrain. The microbe is nothing, right? That's what he said. So now our paradigm is starting to change. Probiotics. Does anyone here take probiotics? You don't have to disclose if you don't want to, but can you imagine, let's say 10, 15 years ago, if you would have said to your doctor, I'm going to take bacteria on purpose in a pill every day? They would have been like, you're nuts, okay? Now they're saying, hey, take probiotics. Saccharomyces boulardii is a yeast. It's a probiotic yeast, which is used to treat Clostridium difficile, C. diff, which is it can be a deadly infection that can be resistant to antibiotics. There's a microvirome and oncolytic viruses. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So it's not just the bacteria, but it's also the viruses. Soil-based organisms are now a thing. We're actually looking now at soil for the next antibiotics that are going to not become resistant, essentially, because they're organisms themselves. Fecal microbial transplant. Has anyone heard of that? It's been in the papers. This is happening in academic centers. We are giving people other people's stool. Okay? We're stepping out of the avoid, right? We're finally starting to understand maybe that's not going to work. And actually, maybe you've also seen recently in the paper vaginal microbial transfer, which is being done in hospitals for babies that are born by C-section. Now, there's like so much more than just having a little swab of fluid going into the mouth of the baby, but it's something, right? Because what we're doing is we're recognizing that what we've been doing might not be helping for optimal health, and maybe even contributing to chronic illness. So I said biodiversity. And what does that mean, and why do I say it's important? So has everyone heard of the hygiene hypothesis? The hygiene hypothesis basically said kids who grow up on farms are less allergic than kids who grow up in cities. And they said, well, it's because they're exposed to germs. And so some researchers went and said, okay, we're going to measure the number of microbes in an urban apartment, and we're going to compare it to microbes on a farm. And what do you think they found? The number of organisms were about equal. So it wasn't that different. But the variety on the farm was very, very diverse. And there were fewer kinds of organisms in the urban apartment. So this idea actually that high diversity is what actually helps reduce the risk of asthma, allergic disease, autoimmune disease, okay? And so this is actually now really kind of a biodiversity hypothesis. It's not exactly the hygiene hypothesis. Well, what about viruses? Because, okay, we know about bacteria being good. We've got the probiotics, all of that stuff. But what about viruses? Those are bad, right? Well, there was actually this fantastic paper that came out in Nature at the end of 2014, and it was talking about something called murine norovirus, which was given to mice that were germ-free. So they basically sterilize the mice as best they can. And we know that when you get antibiotics and you're germ-free, it actually disrupts the way your digestive tract functions, right? So you have kind of, your gut is a little bit of a mess, your immune system is disrupted, a lot of things change. Well, in the mice that got this virus, were given or exposed to this virus, the viruses actually took over for the bacteria completely as if there was no disruption at all. So these viruses mimicked the effect of the commensal bacteria of the gut. And so that actually kind of gives us this idea of this microvirome. Like, what are all the things we're doing? How does that affect the microvirome? And then we kind of have this new literature coming out about the relationship between viruses and cancer. So what we've thought as doctors, what I learned in my training is that, that certain viruses actually can put you at a higher risk for cancer. Now what we're learning is that certain viruses actually are protective. So, for instance, there are a few papers now out about mumps and the risk of developing ovarian cancer later in life. So if you had mumps as a child, you have half the risk of developing ovarian cancer. That's pretty, and so at first it seemed like an association. Maybe it's, just kind of random. Maybe it's it could have been a lot of things. But they actually found that there are certain proteins that are different if you have the mumps that are circulating for life. So it's not just random. There are actually there's better data now. And we're also learning about measles virus, which acts as an oncolytic. So difficult to treat cancers are now, they're now exploring measles, injecting measles into these cancers like glioblastoma multiforme, which is very difficult to treat, or pancreatic cancer, another very difficult to treat cancer. And in many cases, measles seems to have an impact. Now, again, is this the be-all, end-all? No, of course not. But what we're learning is it changes the immune system. And actually, just yesterday, a new paper came out about chickenpox. And having chickenpox reduced the risk of developing gliomas, another kind of brain tumor, by more than 20%. And the authors of the study said this does not seem to be random. It seems very clear. In fact, the people at chickenpox who did develop gliomas had a much less aggressive glioma and had a better course. So, we have to kind of let the juices flow here and think, what does it mean, getting dirty? What does it mean getting germy? What is really best for our health? And how do we kind of look at the whole picture? Parasites. So pretty unequivocally, nobody is really too interested in, getting worms, right? No one wants that. But what if I told you that in populations who have endemic helminths, okay, parasitic worms, they actually have a much lower risk of developing type 2 diabetes. And that also goes for type 1 diabetes. So there's an association. The top of that slide is where there's high incidence of type 1 diabetes, and the bottom map is where there's a high risk of having endemic parasites. And so diabetes is much more common where there's no endemic helminths. So now actually one of the treatments I didn't put on my list before is actually that we're experimentally infecting people with autoimmune conditions with parasites as a treatment. And that is looking to be quite effective in certain conditions. And everything from inflammatory bowel disease to celiac to type 1 diabetes, even asthma, there's research going on right now on this idea. And here, a paper, The Emerging Role of Helminths in the Treatment of Inflammatory Bowel Disorders. And what they say, because I just thought this was fascinating, in the end of the paper is the relationship between humans and nematodes of the gastrointestinal tract can be considered as a mutualism rather than a typical parasitism. So maybe we should be friends with our microbes instead of kind of being at war. And maybe we should be thinking more about our resilient health rather than avoid, attack. Okay? And this is really a different paradigm. And here's just a paper looking at the experimental hookworm infection in people who have celiac. So what was really interesting, I thought, from this paper was actually that the people who had the experimental hookworm infection had a tremendous increase in diversity of microbes. They had a much richer microbiome when they had helminth infection. So, and that seems to really regulate the immune system. And if you think about it, in a lot of these conditions, autoimmune conditions, for instance, or allergic conditions, a lot of times people are getting frequent rounds of antibiotics because their immune systems are so dysregulated. And actually what we may be doing is creating more of a destructive pathway rather than a regenerative pathway. Okay, let's move to a cheerful topic of food coming from healthy soil. So again, fresh food from healthy soil. That is about biodiversity. And what we've learned is that our diet, the diversity of our diet influences also the diversity of our microbiome. Not so surprising. Food is the embodiment of our terrain. We eat animals and plants. Animals live on plants. And plants live on soil, sun, water, and rocks. And we basically ingest all of that. There are also the microbes, right? Plants actually have their own microbiome, as do animals, and mycorrhizae, which live along the roots and connect. They're sort of the plant internet that connects all the plants so they can communicate with each other and act as community, essentially, even though they're non-mobile. So they can't come be together so well, but they can communicate with each other. And actually, the mycorrhizae also help with nutrition for the plants and so on. So when we're eating, we're really part of this community. And we're really internalizing that community to become part of our own bodies. So nutritional depletion makes us vulnerable to chronic illness. So, right, we talked about avoid. Well, depletion is when we're talking about that resilient body and we're talking about the terrain theory. Remember, it's really not the microbe, it's the terrain. We need that nutritional richness. So nutrient density is kind of the theme of what I do if a patient comes to my office, whatever their problem is, and however severe it is. People are often shocked. Let's say a kid is coming in with a lot of seizures, okay? And it's not to say I'm not going to do something about the symptoms, but at the same time, there's no way that I'm going to be able to really heal or reverse illness if the person's not nourished and they don't have the tools within their bodies. So even if you're giving medication, people respond much better when they're eating nutrient-dense food. And of course, they have to be able to absorb it, so you need to know a little bit about gut health. But the first thing is, what are you eating? So reserve is key. And nourishment really equals reserve, okay? And nutrient density creates the resilience. So we have to think really about quality of food. We're thinking about the macronutrient. We're thinking about where it's grown, how it's grown, what happens when it's grown, what kind of chemicals are being put on it, how is that affecting the microbiome of the soil, how is that affecting the microbiome of the plants, what happens after it's grown, how is it processed. So one thing we know, for instance, about wheat, right? A lot of people talk about gluten. Gluten bothers them. Is it really all gluten? Well, we don't know, but what we do know is that wheat is sprayed pretty heavily with Roundup right before it's harvested, because it's a drying agent, and it essentially creates a better harvest because the seeds are released. And then that basically is then taken off and becomes our flour and the wheat that we're eating. And it just had this application of a chemical which impacts our microbiome, impacts our health. So these are questions because it's not obvious when you look at bread what happened, before the wheat came. And that's why, it's not just like a hipster thing to say, where did this food come from? It's a very real issue, which until not that long ago, we all really cared about and knew. Well, we cared, but it really didn't matter because our food came from nearby. Now it's very different. And how quickly is it eaten? That's actually part of it as well. And how is it prepared? So, for instance, some people have a hard time tolerating grains, or beans or nuts. So soaking them, sprouting them, or fermenting them can actually, which is traditionally how people ate those kinds of things, the seed family of food, actually makes it much more nutrient dense for us, because seeds are intended to survive our intestinal tract, right? Because really, they're, things like grain or nuts or whatever are plants wanting to reproduce. And so they have a lot of different kinds of compounds that protect them from our digestive tract. And we're the animals that are supposed to eat them and then walk somewhere and in our scat, leave them somewhere so they can grow. That's not happening so much right now, but that's really the idea, and that's why it's hard for us to break everything down, because we're not intended to be able to do it. So we have to do it through the way we prepare it. So, and nutrition is all of these things. It's the macronutrients, it's the micronutrients, it's phytonutrients as well, right? All the things that make plants different colors are actually the phytonutrients. Microbes, stem cells, pheromones, and little traces of soil. If you go to the farmer's market, for instance, maybe you're not going to get that highly power washed stuff. Maybe you're going to see there's a little dirt still attached to your food, and you might rinse it off. But there's going to be a film, there's going to be a trace, and that's part of your daily probiotic, basically. Okay? It's the best probiotic, in a sense. So eating real food is critically important, and I like to always start with the things that we've been told not to eat, like eggs. Now they're kind of coming back into favor. This is how my eggs look because I keep chickens. I live in New York City, but I have a little yard, and I keep chickens, and we get fresh multicolored eggs, which is pretty fun. And these are how the egg yolks look. And that is because they have lutein and zeaxanthin in them, which actually protect our eyes, our maculas, and also protect us from colon cancer, particularly for young people. It also has vitamin D, because if the chickens are outside, okay, so they're a great source of vitamin D, which most food is not, because if you keep animals indoors, then they don't have vitamin D in their eggs or milk or what have you. And choline, which I'll talk about in a couple minutes. Cholesterol. Eggs are a great source of cholesterol. This is a good thing, not a bad thing. cholesterol are actually what make our cell membranes have structure because they create stiffness, whereas the omega-3s and omega-6s actually create fluidity, and you need to have a balance of those two things in order to have a healthy cell membrane. You also need cholesterol for brain development, particularly in babies, but actually not only. And we're finding that one of the biggest side effects of all these cholesterol medications that people are taking is cognitive dysfunction, actually. And so what we're learning is that cholesterol is really important for the brain. It's so rich in mother's milk and so important that there are actually special enzymes that aid the digestive tract in absorbing cholesterol in a baby from the mother's milk. And we find that cholesterol levels are lower in people who have autism spectrum disorder, people who have depression, and people who have violent behavior, and even people who are suicide completers. So low cholesterol actually, in a very large meta-analysis, predicted an increased risk of dying from gastrointestinal and respiratory illness. So it seems to be that cholesterol actually has a very powerful effect on immune enhancement. And in fact, it actually, having high cholesterol does not, unless you have diabetes, that is actually the one case where cholesterol is problematic. Can be problematic. But if you do not have diabetes, then having higher cholesterol is associated with a lower risk of mortality. Choline, I want to just mention because it's sort of like the forgotten cousin, but it's very high in egg yolks as well as in liver, and it's very important for brain development as well. So in pregnant rats that were given choline, they actually had a very improved cognitive function when they were born, and it was so impressive that even when they were elderly rats, the researchers could still tell which animals had been getting choline in utero. That's pretty impressive. And it's also just something like we all really need in terms of brain function, in terms of detoxification and other things. So, and then of course, we all, I think, know about the essential fatty acids like omega-3s. We hear a lot about it. Hey, it doesn't have to just be from fish. It can also be from eggs, especially from animals, or milk or meat, animals that have been living on pasture. So lower risk of ADD, cancer, learning disabilities, mental illness, seizures, asthma. There is a long, long list of how these essential fatty acids are important for our bodies and brains. And it comes from what we eat. I mean, that's really the upshot. Raw dairy products I like to always mention because it's kind of pretty taboo. And yet, there have been a couple of studies on unboiled milk, not in this country, because it really would be hard to do. It would be hard to get past our IRBs in the hospitals. But there's both the pasture study and the Gabriella study, which looked at infection. The first one looked at infection. So babies or little kids that drank unboiled milk, how did that impact their health? Well, actually, they had fewer fevers, they had fewer ear infections, and fewer respiratory infections. So that was actually, and they had fewer inflammatory markers as well. And in the other study, it actually showed less hay fever, less asthma, less allergy. It's thought that I thought it was going to be about the microbiome, and that when we pasteurize milk, maybe it impacts bacteria, and that may be a part of it as well. But what they found is that pasteurization actually impacts the whey protein, and that whey protein seems to modulate our immune systems differently. Okay, so I see lots and lots and lots of people who cannot tolerate dairy, and I don't think that, I'm not someone who thinks that, cow's milk is only for baby cows, because we've subsisted on dairy forever. Before we were even really doing formal agriculture, even as nomads, we subsisted on different kinds of dairy. But first of all, how was it drunk? And second of all, it was different, okay? Straight from the udder, a little bit different. Eating organic food. Is organic healthier? Is it a hipster thing? Is it a fad? I actually think eating organic is critically important because, first of all, calculations of safety are for each food, but not averaged over many foods, and we don't know what people are eating, particularly children, okay? Because children actually are exposed to more pesticides per body weight because they eat more fruit and vegetables generally than per body weight than we do as adults, and a lot of it is concentrated in fat. There are very interesting studies about Parkinson's and pesticides and other neurologic illnesses, but in addition to that, this is a study that was done in a Mexican population where, farming population, where the people in the valley were using pesticides, and that the people who didn't want to use pesticides from this same community moved to the foothills. So you see that, and then a psychologist came and evaluated their development, and this is one of the developmental tests that was published. I really think of this as a landmark study because this is one of the developmental tests we do in children to see how they're developing, how do they draw a person. And you can see in an age-matched way that the children who were in the foothills, that's no pesticides, had these beautiful people, looked much more like people than the children of the same age or older in the valley. And in that case, they were actually much more scribble, didn't really look so much like people. There was really a pattern of developmental delay. And so pesticides do have an impact. We know that organic diets significantly lower dietary exposure to pesticides. This has actually been looked at in several studies. So we look at the urine, and we look at metabolites of these pesticides in the urine, and the levels are lower. And we know that ADHD is higher, the risk of ADHD is higher, actually double, in children. In this study, it was looking at over 1,100 children who had higher levels of these organophosphate pesticide metabolites. Okay, eating plants. This is sounds obvious, right? Yes, eat your fruit and vegetables, but there's really great science behind it. And we, again, want that biodiversity that I talked about before. You want a rainbow on your plate. Turns out my mom was right when she said that when I was a kid. And part of it is because of the phytonutrients that make all those different colors. Phytonutrients actually are interact with everything from our cell membranes and our organ systems to our actual DNA, and they are in conversation with our bodies all the time. One of my favorite phytonutrients to talk about are actually the bitter compounds. Anyone here ever use bitters, bitter tonic? They're amazing. Really, if you want something, okay, speaking of magic bullets, this is like one of those things that influences increasing stomach acid, which helps digest better, increases motility, so bloating, burping, constipation, gas, all those things improve, help with boosting the immune system of the digestive tract, so it helps protect you from the gastroenteritis and those things that you don't want to get in the wintertime. Actually interacts with your liver to boost detoxification, interacts with your pancreas so that your blood sugar stays more stable, and boosts your immune system even in your ear, nose, throat, and lungs to help protect you from whatever cold and flu is coming your way. Bitters are even being looked at as a treatment for asthma because it helps bronchodilation. This happens partly because why? What do bitters remind our body of? Poison. So our bodies are like, get really stand up. Okay, we need to take care of a lot of things and be really good at it and be efficient. And so a bitter tonic, there's a favorite bitter tonic many people like. So only a couple of you raised your hand when I said anyone use bitter tonic, but does anyone here like coffee? No? Yeah? Okay. That's part of, I think, the craving that people have for coffee. It's not just about caffeine, but it's about the bitter compounds in there. And they actually have a very, you've heard people say, oh, if I don't have my coffee, I can't poop, right? So that's part of what the bitters are doing. Beer, anyone here like beer? So that's another bitter tonic because of the hops. And dark chocolate, someone asked me about chocolate before I started and said, my kids love chocolate. Dark chocolate is a bitter. It's got, it doesn't have too much sugar, and cacao is a bitter tonic. And you can make hot chocolate very lightly sweetened. Get yourself or your kids used to that, and that can be their bitter tonic. Peel of fruits and vegetables also have bitter components to them, and the leafy greens, all of that. You don't have to be eating broccoli rabe or dandelion greens every day. Chamomile tea is another bitter. Fermented foods, okay, we want to be we want the soil, but we also want the fermented foods, which just help us mind our microbes. Okay, a word about sugar, because it's a topic that we hear a lot about, and it's pretty demonized. So I do want to say that sugar, there's a lot we could say about it, and I really talk about it in great detail in my book, but one of the things that sugar does do is it stimulates insulin, right? So that makes sense because we have to manage the sugar, and insulin is actually a pro-inflammatory. So sometimes people will come and say, oh, my kid, when they eat sugar, they start to act crazy. Or people will say, when I eat sugar, I feel really mean, or I feel really angry. And they're told, no, that can't be true. Actually, yes, because when you have that pro-inflammatory cascade happening, it influences the way your brain functions. And you're basically having a big spike in insulin in some sensitive people can really influence their behavior. And other things too, right? Some people will feel more pain. If they have pain issues, they might be more in pain when they have it. Part of it is the way insulin actually stimulates this enzyme called phospholipase A2, which helps to basically dissolve your cell membrane, fats in your cell membrane. And that is obviously not a great thing. But what about honey? What about a natural sugar? So honey actually, interestingly, is being looked at now as a treatment for type 1 diabetes. Why? Because it stabilizes blood sugar levels and insulin levels. So I'm not, obviously this is something to do in moderation. I'm not saying let's all go out and start drinking honey, but because all sweets are really not things that if you've ever gone maple sugaring, does anyone know how much? It takes a lot of the sap in order to make a little container of maple syrup. So we're not intended to get tons and tons of sugar in our diet, but if you're going to have sweeteners, raw honey is fantastic. It actually has wound healing benefits, immune regulating benefits, and it actually stabilizes the blood sugar. Blackstrap molasses is one of my favorite things because it's actually higher in antioxidants than several containers of blueberries. Molasses is the leftovers when we take sugar, extract sugar from sugar cane. Everything that's left becomes this soupy, sticky, thick conglomeration, which is molasses. And it's really high in iron, it's high in antioxidants, it's high in a lot of minerals. And it is one of the best ways I've found to treat constipation in kids, actually, and in everyone. You just take, a teaspoon a day of the blackstrap molasses, and it's a great source of digestible iron. All right, last category: time and nature. So everything's connected. We've got our microbial health, which affects our soil health. Soil health affects plant health. Plant health affects animal health, and plant and animal health affects human health, and soil health affects human health. So soil organisms actually make us happy. There are several studies on this Mycobacterium vaccae, which is a soil organism, okay? And it's been looked at in cancer patients where it actually improved emotional health, vitality, and cognitive function. It improved cognition in another study where it lowered their stress levels and made them more relaxed. And that actually is because Mycobacterium vaccae actually increases serotonin levels as if the animal or the person was getting an SSRI, like a antidepressant. That's how much it boosts our serotonin levels. And these soil organisms even can improve cognition. So in Mycobacterium vaccae mice, okay, we're navigating a difficult maze twice as fast and with half the anxiety of the ones that did not get the exposure. And we need the constant exposure because in these mice, the superhero effect, as they called it, lasted only for 3 weeks. What about sunshine? Well, there's this epidemic of nearsightedness going on. We all kind of thought it's genetic. It turns out that it's actually so severe in Korea right now that 97% of young men are nearsighted. And that's considered epidemic levels. Well, turns out, by accident, it was discovered that being exposed to sunlight, natural light, seems to reverse that effect. So what's happening to all of us and all of our, all of the kids who are sitting inside looking at screens all day, we're not getting so much natural light, and it's actually impacting vision development. Not only that, but in a study, and this study is being mined because it's just another aspect of it was just released a few weeks ago. But this study looked in Sweden at 30,000 women over 20 years and found that women who assiduously avoided sun exposure were twice as likely to die as those who didn't. It just came out recently. They said this is actually akin to the risk of being a smoker, avoiding the sun. And in people who did get skin cancer, by the way, of those women, the ones who were exposed to the sun had less aggressive cancer, easier to treat. Nature enhances healing. So when rooms overlook trees in hospitals, patients have shorter postoperative hospital stays, lower scores for complications, fewer negative comments in the nurse's notes, we all want that, and less need for strong analgesics. Nature also reduces pain and anxiety. So exposure to nature can lower heart rate and self-reports of emotional distress. Patients felt calmer on days there was a mural of a natural scene on the wall than when the wall was blank. And nature, in several studies, and some of them are in children and many of them also in adults, actually, so children who play on natural playgrounds had fewer attention and cognitive issues. Their concentration was better, their cognitive and physical functioning was better, and test performance was better. Okay? Has anyone here heard of Shinrin-yoku, forest bathing? So this is a very much a part of the culture in Japan, and it's immersing yourself in the forest. And a lot of studies have been done on this because it's actually used as preventive medicine, where they actually get a prescription to go spend more time in the forest. And not only does it improve cognition, improve focus, improve sleep, lower levels of cortisol, which are the stress hormones, and so on, but actually it boosted natural killer cell function, so it helped the immune system to function better, and improved the number of anti-cancer proteins circulating. So it helps protect us from cancer just by being in the forest. So dirt, eat it. Try to get organic or biodynamic produce. Try to avoid power-washed vegetables. Cook your food with peels or eat it with peels if you can. Grow food in it. Eat plants that were grown in healthy soil, and only eat animal products and meat from animals that lived on pasture, lived outside, okay? Nourish your soil, so composting, mulching, no chemical fertilizers and pesticides if you can avoid it. Bathe in it, get dirty, go make some mud pies. I don't care how old you are. If you need a kid, find a kid to do it with, okay? But getting dirty is really important. And it's like pretty obvious, right? Try to grow a little food. I don't care if you're in an apartment and you have a little pot of herbs so you can have your own fresh food, or go to your farmers markets, or join a CSA, keep chickens. It's not that hard to do. Go to community gardens if you don't have your own space. Go foraging. I started doing this last year. I found like 30 pounds of maitake mushrooms in the New York City park right near me. If I wanted to sell that, no, but I ate it. It was amazing, okay? Cooking together, eating together, and getting outside. So our choice is between this and this. Thank you very much. So I'm happy to take questions, if anyone has any.
You mentioned food allergies, and I saw a study said that a lot of common food allergies like eggs and peanuts, that those substances are substrates for growing vaccines. But I haven't seen any other confirmation of that. I don't know if you've heard of anything besides the one?
It's true that some of those can be used as substrates in growing certain aspects of vaccines. There's data also that shows that probably the aluminum seems to, because it's given as an adjuvant, really, which is on purpose to stimulate the immune system because you want it to respond to whatever the antigen is, right? Whatever it may be, pertussis or measles or whatever. Actually, those adjuvants seem to increase the risk of developing food allergies. So particularly when people are getting, children particularly are getting their vaccines, one of the things that I outline in the book is that giving foods, we're introducing a lot of new foods at the same time, and those foods and those vaccines actually are designed to make the body much more allergic. And because children are getting a lot of them all at one time, it may prime the body to become more allergic. So that may be an element. Yes?
Hi. Yeah, I have two questions. One, maybe building on that a little bit on allergies or food sensitivities.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any thoughts or advice on the issue of babies being born with different food sensitivities? And then the second question is, realistically, how do we get raw milk into our diets or our kids' diets?
So babies being born with them really has a lot to do with what's happening in utero and what's happening at birth. So definitely, everything from, because babies are born with what we would call leaky guts. That used to be an alternative medicine term, but now it's not anymore. We just call it increased gut permeability. That's the science term. But basically, it's normal to have that. And because of a lot of things that we're doing, maybe because of adjuvants, maybe because of how babies are born, and maybe our own, as the people giving birth, microbiomes might be a little disrupted, it can put certain babies more at risk for developing food allergies. So part of what I recommend, if possible, is to breastfeed, is to do probiotics, and there are infant probiotics that are designed specifically for babies. And as far as the raw milk goes, there are ways to get it. It's state by state. I definitely recommend raw milk should be state certified because you want to know. I personally visit any farm that I would get raw milk from. I wouldn't just get it from a random place and drink it. I think it's important to know where it's coming from, and I want to know that it's state certified because you can check for any kind of significant contamination. But there are websites that can connect you with raw milk producers. A lot of Amish farmers will go all around the East Coast as well. So I'm happy to connect you with some of those resources.
One quick follow-up. Does raw milk cheese give you the same benefits? Because that's more readily available.
In certain ways, yes. In certain ways, yes, because it was never pasteurized, so you're kind of avoiding, hopefully, most of the organisms that could be an issue, but without changing the way.
Thanks.
What's your take in general on vaccinations? Because you mentioned measles and mumps might have positive benefits, but I'd rather not get measles and mumps when I'm too old, so I need to be vaccinated at one point. Are you basically saying that kids shouldn't be vaccinated that early? But then child mortality with those diseases is a problem as well. Right. I'm a bit confused. What are you trying to say?
I think what I'm saying is that we don't get something for nothing, and that we really need to study this, because I think previously we sort of thought of everything infectious as being kind of contamination and totally negative. So the question is, how can we gain those do we gain those kinds of benefits being vaccinated? It's not clear. And what can we do if we're leading to, if we're doing this medical intervention on 100% of people, essentially, that might be disrupting their immune health or their gut health in some way and putting them more at risk. So this is something I think that we need to really study carefully, and it's not really being studied.
But my understanding always was that being vaccinated basically causes the same immune response from the body as if you were actually having those viruses.
It's not exactly the same.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
It can approximate, but it's not exactly the same. And like I said, we just haven't been this is new science. I mean, almost all of those papers are things that came out over the past few years. So this is something that we're really going to need to carefully investigate to see essentially what the impact is of vaccination. Do we get that same benefit or not? And what is the long-term effect?
Okay.
Hi. I suspect there's a lot of special interests who aren't exactly thrilled with the message you're discovering. Have you gotten any interesting reactions, you or the other researchers who are working in this field, to some of the major pharmaceutical and agricultural practitioners?
I think their strategy, as much as possible, is to kind of black out what's happening. So the less attention gotten, the better. And I've definitely heard from some of the other media opportunities. They've said, "Oh, we're really interested," and then I've heard back, our sponsors wouldn't like it. So I think that's their primary approach, and I do think that there are a lot of corporate interests that are not in favor of the kind of science that is being done now.
And what about kind of standard medical training? Are doctors opening up to this?
I think to some degree. It depends on the doctors, but I think there are definitely doctors who are open to it if we're looking at the science in a critical way. I think raw milk is very ingrained as being a terrible thing in doctors, so that's a tough one. And I also talk quite a bit, I have a whole section on fluoride, and that's another thing that doing fluoridated water is another thing that's really, really difficult for doctors to wrap their heads around. But in other ways, I think they're open. I mean, depends.
Yeah, thanks.
Hi, do you have any thoughts on being vegan? You mentioned plants and animals a lot.
Yeah.
And is there a right way to do it, or is it just very difficult?
I think that children probably should really not be vegan ever, or it would be really, really difficult to do well. Vegetarian has to also be really careful, but at least the thing is that animal products are very, very nutrient dense and have certain properties that the quality is different than, protein is not protein is not protein. That said, do I think being vegan can be good for some people? Sure, especially because I don't necessarily think that we have to adhere to one diet our whole entire lives. I was a vegetarian actually for many years, and then at a certain point in time, my body kind of screamed and didn't like it, and then I ate meat, and that was better for me. But obviously, the way I eat meat, as I talk about, is doing it, I think, differently than a lot of people. But I think what's really important is to listen to your body. So, for instance, I've had patients who have come to me that were vegan or strict vegetarian, and they were really sick. And when I told them one of my patients, when I told her I thought she should eat meat, she cried. I mean, she was really angry with me. She actually stopped coming to me, but I happened to know her socially as well. So 5 years later, she came to me, and she had a significant autoimmune disease. And she said, "I've started having meat once a week, and I feel amazing. It's changed me. My energy is completely different." This doesn't have to be for everyone, but I do think that it's important to listen to your body.
Awesome, thank you.
I was wondering about the sun exposure. My father died from melanoma, and my mom is Korean, so I never go in the sun. And is it a vitamin D thing? Would you take vitamin D pills and that would solve it, or is it you really need to be out in the sunshine?
Yeah, that's a really important question. Thank you for asking it. So number one, the major danger is sunburn. Okay, so you don't want to burn. So if you're someone who burns very quickly, you have to be very careful and go out in the sun at times of day where it's not very, very strong. You do want that sun exposure, and it's not clear that it's just vitamin D. Vitamin D is an element, but sun, again, we like to really kind of simplify and reduce things to go outside and get your vitamin D. It's probably more than that, but what the literature actually shows is that chronic sun exposure, a little bit of chronic sun exposure every day is protective from developing melanoma. So a little bit each day. I do know some people who say, when I go out in the sun, I feel sick. I feel terrible. I think, again, listening to your body is really important, but I do think getting some sun is important. It just depends on how much and what time of day, so that you're protecting yourself, and covering up at times of day that are strong or just staying out of the sun. Thank you so much, everyone.